And let's take a trip on to Duval County and talk about the Jacksonville Jaguars. So the interesting thing when we talk about the AFC South is all four of these teams have been in the playoffs the last 2 years. Obviously, you're division winners, but both years being able to send a wild card team. And the Jacksonville Jaguars in particular, they were just in the AFC Championship game 2 years ago. And if they don't give the ball back to Tom Brady, they might be in the Super Bowl. Can this team return to its 2017 form?
So I think they're starting to make some good moves. I thought they had a pretty big offseason. Will they ever get there again? I think they could. This year, to me, does not seem to be that year for them. But I could see if they make a few more moves, right, that they possibly could get back to their form.
I mean, it's such a tough division, so competitive. Someone's going to have to bite the bullet in this division and be subpar. Whether it's going to be them or the Titans, that's definitely up to debate. But at this point, there's no more excuses when it comes to Blake Bortles. He's gone. You have Nick Foles there this year. Nick Foles is kind of an interesting cat when we talk about this because outside of Philadelphia, Nick Foles hasn't exactly had too much career success. In fact, he has never played an entire NFL season. He's topped out with 11 games in 2015, and that was his 1 year in St. Louis. Now, you can argue why his year in St. Louis was a bit subpar. He was playing under Jeff Fisher, and we do know that hasn't necessarily produced the greatest results for his quarterbacks and his teams, close to being the NFL's losing his coach. We talked about Hugh Jackson a few weeks ago as far as the worst modern-day head coach. Jeff Fisher is definitely up there, save one Super Bowl run. He almost retired back in 2016 if it wasn't for Andy Reid basically saving his career by offering him a job with KC. But he did mention that he also had elbow issues besides that. So whether those rear their ugly heads again remains to be seen. But this is going to be the first year in a while that he's been expected to be the starter from start to finish.
Yeah. I mean, it's interesting now, right? So he has his Super Bowl MVP, though. So do you think he can ever get back to playing at that level now that sort of the pressure's been let off, right? Like, hey, he was subpar. He really shined in, his biggest moment. Do you think he can get back to his MVP sort of level?
Well, I mean, he's reuniting with his offensive coordinator he had down in Philadelphia, John DeFilippo. And it's arguable whether or not DeFilippo was the scapegoat out in Minnesota last year. I definitely agree that Mike Zimmer might have been too prudent on wanting to suppress the passing game. One of the big arguments they have philosophy-wise was whether he was throwing the ball too much. We talked about that a couple weeks ago when we discussed Minnesota. But it made sense out there in Minnesota. You just signed a 3 years guaranteed quarterback. You had weapons like Adam Thielen, Stephon Diggs. Here in Jacksonville, you don't really have the pieces to run a vertical passing game. I think D.D. Westbrook can be a solid receiver for them, but I don't think Nick Foles is the type of guy you tell him to throw it 30 to 40 times a week.
Yeah, that was going to be my main concern is I just don't know about the offensive weapons around them. I know they picked up Jeff Swaim, who we didn't really talk about with the Cowboys, but he was kind of just an okay tight end, right? Had 242 yards and 1 touchdown. They lost Dante Moncrief, though, which they picked up Chris Horley. But, yeah, I just don't know if he necessarily has the weapons to be good again.
Yeah, and one of his biggest weapons is going to be Leonard Fournette. In the last years, Leonard Fournette has missed 11 games. He's dealt with when we talk about stuff like freak injuries versus players that are injury-prone, one of the big ones that worries me is when you start hearing about those soft tissue injuries. Leonard Fournette last year dealt with multiple injuries to his hamstring, and hamstrings are one of those funny injuries where they just keep coming back. When you think you're over them, you take one wrong step, and suddenly you're back on the injured list for the next 3 weeks. He's averaged less than 4 rushing yards per attempt for his career, too. So it's going to be interesting whether the offensive line could dig in, give him more room to operate, especially now that I believe that defenses are going to want to stack the box a little bit more on him too, even though you're transitioning from Bortles to Foles. You kind of wonder how Fournette's long-term future looks too when you consider he hasn't exactly ingratiated himself to Tom Coughlin. When he was suspended last year for starting a fight with the Bills, it voided all of his guaranteed money, which means basically the Jags wanted to cut Fournette right now. They don't owe him a dime for the rest of his contract. Week 17, Tom Coughlin made a statement saying he was disappointed in how Fournette and Yeldon were behaving on the sidelines. They looked completely disinterested in the game. So Leonard Fournette has to mature and mature quick.
Yeah. No, I think those are all really good points on the offensive side. So what do you think about their defensive side?
Okay, well, they made a very interesting pickup in Josh Allen at number 7. I probably guess they didn't believe that Josh Allen was going to slide to them, thinking that the Giants might have picked him up at 6. So they were definitely probably more than happy to see that. He adds them another strong pass rusher, as he had 17 sacks last year in 2019 for Kentucky. It's almost a shame that this team doesn't play the Bills, because I would have loved the opportunity to see Josh Allen sack Josh Allen. Not only that, of course, Jalen Ramsey and his feud with Josh Allen, Bills Josh Allen as well. It's interesting. We're going to want to see how Yannick Ngakoue performs, given that he didn't receive a new deal from the Jaguars after his holdout ended. So it's going to be interesting to see how he responds. Does he perform twice as hard to get that big deal, or does he kind of rest in his laurels due to, being a little bit down?
Yeah. And, well, I know we talked a little bit, right, about do they return to the form in which, they had played the Patriots that one year and made it into the playoffs. A lot of that was because their defense was so good. So I do like the Josh Allen pickup. And I think that's really going to be the identity of this team, is can they really improve or, continue to maintain good defense while Nick Foles and some of the offensive weapons they have at least increase the offense just enough to finally get them there. I don't think it'll happen this year, but that is sort of the identity they had that one year in which they really performed.
Between Ngakoue and Jalen Ramsey, whether they choose to shell out money to protect their defense over the next couple of years. Picked up the 5th-year option on Jalen Ramsey, which means he's due for $13.7 million in 2020. He's playing out the 4th year of his rookie deal right now. It's going to be interesting to see how the Bringstrunk stunt at training camp affects his bottom line with Tom Coughlin in the years to come. I'm going to go ahead and give them a 8-8 record this year. They were finished last year 5-11, so I'm predicting Foles is about a 3-win difference for them.
I've only got them at a 2-win difference, so I'm saying 7-9 for them.
Okay, that's fair. Let's move on to the Music City. It's interesting. So this team is 9-7, and we did mention they were going to be a tough team for week 1 when they played the Browns. They have a lot of questions around them, particularly when it comes to their quarterback situation. Marcus Mariota is officially going to be playing out the 5th year of his rookie deal. The Titans do have the option to perhaps franchise tag him next year, although the franchise tag next year would be $25 million. And it's going to be interesting. What do you consider Marcus Mariota at this point in his career? He's drawn a lot of comparisons to an Alex Smith type, where he's good, but is good enough to kind of push you over the hump. Similar to Alex Smith, he's dealt with a lot of change between his coordinators and head coaches over the years. This will be his 4th offensive coordinator and 3rd head coach just in the 5 years he's been in Tennessee. So, can you really fault him that much for his lack of production?
Yeah, I think that's the thing, right, is a certain level of consistency is required. Obviously, coaches are under a whole lot of pressure to win right away, but sometimes it takes a little bit of a while to build up the system, right? Hey, I know which guys we're going to target in the draft. I know the style of, play that we want to have. But a lot of all of, I guess, sort of the changes, like you said, with all the coordinators, it keeps from forming a consistent system. And while granted, the head coach is supposed to sort of say, hey, overall, here's the direction we're going, they've also had a whole lot of head coaches. So I can't really fault Mariota. I do think he's limited as a quarterback, even if he was in a really good situation. I don't know if he would ever win a Super Bowl, but at the same time, I can't completely fault him.
Well, 2016 was definitely his peak year. He played 15 games, 3,426 passing yards, 26 touchdowns, and 9 interceptions. Since then, in the last 2 years, 28 games, he averages about 2,880 yards per year, and he's totaled 23 touchdowns. So in the last 2 years combined, he has less than he did in his 2016 season. So can he recapture that? I definitely do think there's something there with Mariota. I witnessed it in that playoff game he had against the Chiefs a couple years back when he threw 2 late touchdowns. They were down, if I'm not mistaken, 21-3. So it was an impressive comeback. And there's not a lot of playoff winning quarterbacks in the NFL. We saw how much that's valued with what Nick Foles got with the Jaguars right now. So I definitely don't think we can really take for granted the skills that Marcus Mariota brings to the table. He did get sacked 42 times last year and did suffer through nerve damage. When it comes to Mariota, we also do talk about injuries. He hasn't necessarily been injury prone per se. He's averaged about 14 to 15 games per year. It's just he gets hurt at probably the wrong times. If it wasn't for the injury in week 17 last year, this team might have made the playoffs as they were in a win-or-go-home game against the Colts last year. He will have to compete now, too, without his starting left tackle, Taylor Lewan, who got suspended for the first 4 games. What do you think of Lewan posting his polygraph test on Twitter?
So I think it's interesting. A lot of the players want to prove, right, obviously, that they didn't knowingly. Though I will say, from a league standpoint, they probably don't care about polygraphs too much because polygraphs themselves can be beaten and it's been proven. So I'm not surprised that if the league says, like, hey, no, it doesn't matter what your polygraph is. So I do think it's an interesting approach. It's kind of a new approach, and it at least saves face with, fans possibly, right? There's no real backlash for him if he says, no, look, like, here's my polygraph results. I didn't knowingly take it. Yes, I might be suspended, but I want everybody to at least know that I'm not just BSing. Like I said, polygraphs can be beaten, so I don't think the league will ever say, hey, we'll use that as a means to clear players, but I think it's an interesting approach.
Well, I don't think there's any reason for Marcus Mariota ultimately to be in a quarterback competition with Ryan Tannehill. At this point, we know what Ryan Tannehill is. If you want to call Marcus Mariota injury prone, Tannehill epitomizes injury prone. Every time we do think we're going to finally see it be the year, he's been hurt. And I don't know if you can really count on it. It's interesting that the Titans invested draft capital to actually trade for him, but I'm not going to put much stock in this competition. I think they just brought Tannehill in there to push him. It's going to be interesting to see what kind of identity this team establishes. So in the second round, they went out, they got A.J. Brown out of Ole Miss. Many believed him to be a better receiver than even DK Metcalf, who was a combine darling. They signed Adam Humphries to improve the play in the slot receiver role for him. And then he does get Delanie Walker back from injury. Walker actually led this team in receptions every year, 2014 through 2017, with a league high for tight ends, 94 receptions in 2015. You also do have Deion Lewis out of the backfield. And then this is going to be Corey Davis's third year. He was a first-round pick, so it's about time that he steps up. In 2018, he consistently drew teams' top cornerbacks, which now that they do have more weapons around him, that's definitely going to divert attention, and hopefully he can take a step. But in terms of identity, I think this team's probable strength is going to be doubling down on the power running game. Last year, we did see improved production from Derrick Henry in the stretch run. In fact, in the final 8 games, he ran for 759 yards and 10 touchdowns. Just to put that into perspective, he ran for 1,059 yards total in 2018.
Yeah. Going back to Delanie Walker, I think that might really be what makes the difference, right? Is, like you said, he led the Titans in receptions for 2014 through 2017. He broke his leg. So if he can recover from that leg injury, hopefully there was no soft tissue damage that also occurred during the leg injury, which I haven't heard of there being. So hopefully he can get back to form. They do have quite a few offensive tools and weapons. So I do think it can be an interesting year. If anything, this could probably be Mariota's, best year to show that, hey, no, I am worthy of still being a starting quarterback, given all that, he now has with Adam Humphries, if A.J. Brown pans out, Delanie Walker, Corey Davis, Deion Lewis, so.
Well, this definitely is a prove-it year. So, if Mariota's going to perform, now's the time. I do find this team's defense also interesting. They were actually third in points per game allowed in 2018, only allowing their opponents 18.9. They did sign Kevin Byard to an extension, 5 years, $75 million. No one's really paying safeties these days, so it's going to be interesting to see how that pans out for them. I did say that Jacksonville was going to take a jump up, which means – by virtue, someone in this division is going to have to bite the bullet. So I'm going to give the Tennessee Titans 6-10.
Okay. So I have the Tennessee Titans not quite sliding that far back. I have them going 8-8. But if somebody were to talk me into Jacksonville taking a leap over them and the Titans falling, 7-9, 6-10, I could see it. Right now I'm sticking 8-8.
Well, it's an interesting collection of talent both teams have. This is going to be a tough division. These teams are just going to beat each other up. Now when we talk about the Colts, now we know this team has the talent, but do they have the luck? But seriously, though.
Too young for dad jokes, Ju-Ju. You're too young for dad jokes.
When I actually do become a dad, I'm expecting to become a super dad between my dad. Now,
God.
When it comes to Andrew Luck, the big concern always is going to be his health as well. So right now he's been dealing with this weird injury that is at a calf, is it an ankle? It sounds like it's a high ankle sprain now, according to their GM, Chris Ballard. The problem with the Colts, at least when it comes to Andrew Luck, is these injuries always start off seeming so minor, and then they progressively become worse. Like, I remember back to the entire 2017 season he missed. There was reports, he might be ready by week 1. He'll probably just miss a couple games. Then week 8 passed, 10, and suddenly the season's gone. And we still had a lot of mystery in the air whether or not Andrew Luck was going to play football again. Granted, he was getting beat up consistently by the poor offensive line that their previous administration had put in front of him. I do think Chris Ballard is one of the best executives in the league. Like, we gave a lot of praise to John Dorsey a couple of weeks ago, but we left this guy, Howie Roseman, out of the discussion. What this guy has been able to do in the last 2 drafts has been really remarkable, between going and taking a chance on Quentin Nelson, getting him in the top 10 when a lot of people say guards shouldn't go that high, stealing late-round talent like Darius Leonard, who led the NFL in tackles last year. But still, the constant theme is what's going on with Andrew Luck. It's like a dark cloud surrounding what I predict could have been a very optimistic season for this team.
Yeah, well, so something else I'll say about their GM, Chris Ballard, right, is he was also able to re-sign all of their own free agents this year, which I don't know how often that really happens. So credit to, I guess, the team that's, performing well as a whole. But you're right, Andrew Luck is the big sort of question that there is right now.
Yeah, and is he going to miss week 1? We just don't know at this point. If it's a high ankle injury, those are – we talk about hamstrings being tedious injuries. High ankle injuries oftentimes can be 4 to 6 week injuries sometimes, and that's on the low side of estimating it.
And they're very painful. So even if he feels that he's able to come back, I've heard that sometimes a high ankle sprain feels worse than just a broken ankle. And so we don't even know if he does come back in time, what is his level of play going to be?
I do think a lot of people jump the gun in comparing this to the Kevin Durant injury. 2 completely different situations. And I do think at minimum, especially after that injury, the Colts definitely took this seriously. Maybe if it wasn't necessarily displayed to the media or out there in the public sphere, I definitely do believe that they were working diligently behind the scenes, but somehow this injury just happened to linger all the way from March, all the way into training camp now, as he got shut down on the 3rd day this year.
Yeah, and you sort of talked about it earlier, but my main concern is if you're not able to diagnose it, how do you know that you're treating it correctly? And so right now we're sort of being told it's a high ankle sprain, but if it's sort of, well, maybe it's my calf, maybe it's this part, maybe it's that part, maybe it's, an ankle sprain. I just wonder if they're able to treat it correctly, given that it's sort of been this weird, ambiguous sort of injury.
Well, according to Chris Ballard, the exact quote, it's a small little bone. Now, at least we've determined it's a bone injury. That's progress compared to where we were previously when this whole news developed. The thing is, this team can't afford to miss Andrew Luck, what you would define as a transformative talent. So we do remember that transition year between Peyton and Luck where they were just god-awful.
Yep.
They went 2-14 in 2011. Luck comes in as a rookie. Suddenly they're 11-5 and in the playoffs. Then 2017, Luck misses the season. They're 4-12. He comes back, 2018, 10-6 in the playoffs. They do have a decent backup behind him in Jacoby Brissett. There's a lot of teams out there that would love to trade for Brissett right now. And, when you look at his 2017 stat line, it wasn't the worst. 3,098 passing yards, 13 touchdowns to 7 interceptions. So, about 2 touchdowns per pick. But, he did fall victim to that horrible offensive line as he was sacked himself 52 times. And they did have a bottom 5 passing attack in the league that year. But speaking of Chris Ballard, he did add some more pieces to this team that if Andrew Luck is on the field, he can definitely utilize. This year in the 2nd round, he took arguably one of the biggest draft steals in Paris Campbell, one of Dwayne Haskins' favorite targets out of Ohio State. Last year, Paris Campbell pulled down 12 of Haskins' 50 touchdowns. They did also add in Devin Funchess, who's a bit of a big target, was one of Cam's favorite targets last year, And this team loves to target tight ends, and we know they love big bodies in the red zone.
Mm-hmm.
That's exactly what Devin Funchess fits. That's the role he plays. They have Mo Alley-Cox, who's apparently looking like a completely different player in camp this year. He was a converted basketball player out of Virginia Commonwealth. And then they do add Jack Doyle back to this team. He missed tons of games last year, only played 6 games as he was dealing through not only a hip injury, but a lacerated kidney.
Yeah, I think they picked up a lot of good pieces. I think their offense hopefully all improves, especially Funchess, like you said, can add to their offense. I also like their defense in the draft that they picked up as well. I don't think this team got any worse from last year. Like I said, they didn't lose any free agents. They picked up quite a few people, had some good offensive drafts. But their defensive side, too, also seems like it improved.
Yeah. So knowing what I know and I'm going to assume for now that Andrew Luck doesn't miss any time. I'm going to give this team an 11-5 finish.
That's exactly where I put them, 11-5.
Perfect. Okay, let's just move on quickly. Let's go on to the Houston Texans. The way we talk about the Texans, it doesn't feel like they won the division last year. We talk so much about the other teams that I feel like the Houston Texans kind of get lost in the shuffle. Last year, they started the season 0-3 and then rattled off 9 straight wins. You kind of figured Deshaun Watson was going to start a little bit slow coming off of that ACL injury, but he really bounced back in a big way, and I'm interested to see what his year 3 development is. We focus a lot on quarterbacks, so I actually want to start on their coach first before we really get into like Deshaun Watson and his development. So when it comes to Bill O'Brien, this is going to be his 6th year in Houston. He's actually has a very quality record, 80-42, but one of the big ones that stands out is he's 1-3 in the playoffs. And that one win only came via the Derek Carrless Raiders in the 2016 playoffs. Granted, he did have Brian Hoyer as his quarterback, so I don't know if that kind of equals it out. But ultimately, they were playing a team without their quarterback in an MVP year. They went ahead, they fired their GM, so that just means that Bill O'Brien's only seizing more control as he tries to bring in more and more Patriots guys. He wanted to bring in Nick Caserio in for an interview as they're close friends out of New England. And unfortunately for him, it didn't quite work out. So it's kind of led into a lot of weird flubs. They traded away a 2020 4th-round pick for Duke Johnson. But if Duke Johnson plays just 10 games, that suddenly becomes a 3rd-rounder, which doesn't seem like adequate value for a 3rd-down running back. Then they went out there. They missed on the offensive tackle they wanted and had to settle on Titus Howard out of Alabama State, so small school offensive tackle who was originally a high school quarterback that just happened to put on 100 pounds in college. And now they're dealing with this Jadeveon Clowney situation, and Lord knows if they're going to get a good return on investment if they have to trade him.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so I think it's interesting that you talk about the playoff record, right? So not too long ago, everybody was talking about Marvin Lewis with the Bengals, right? So, hey, he's made it to the playoffs several times, never won a playoff game. And so in this case, okay, you won one of your playoff games, but do you think we could possibly see a regime change anytime soon?
Well, at this point, now that he's taking more and more power, it seems unlikely that someone would come in and knock him out. It does seem like he does have a good relationship with ownership right now as well. And I do think Bill O'Brien is a good coach. Now, it's kind of funny because when you talk about like former Patriots disciples, obviously Matt Patricia managed to sneak out a win last year against the Patriots. Mike Vrabel had his Titans team drum the Patriots around a little bit too. But Bill O'Brien just can't get by his mentor.
Yeah. And maybe, part of that is having too much respect, right, from where you came from, rather than always, assuming that you could beat them or planning to actually beat them, given a little bit too much respect, not enough preparation. So it's interesting. I don't know. I just think in a league where winning is everything, that he may be on the hot seat. I don't think this year or next year, but I could see maybe another 2-3 years out.
Yeah, potentially. You definitely can see Deshaun Watson potentially developing into one of those league's next great quarterbacks. I've always liked Deshaun going back to his time at Clemson. Seeing those title games against Alabama was some of the best football I've ever seen. I've never really been a big college guy, but when I saw Deshaun Watson play, that made me a fan.
Yeah. Well, I think, sorry to cut you off, but not only that, he had his lung injury, right, last season, which you could tell he was obviously walking off the field, holding his chest. So I think it was coming off of a sack. and he couldn't even, ride on a plane with his teammates because they're afraid that his lung would collapse due to the pressure changes in elevation. And so the fact that he was still able to keep playing and still took him into the playoffs, I totally respect him. I think he's one of the better quarterbacks in the league, especially out of the young quarterbacks.
Yeah, he's an absolute gamer, which is going to be interesting to see. Like, we talk about bad offensive lines. We talk about what that did to hurt Andrew Luck in his development, staying healthy long term. Mm-hmm. Unfortunately, Deshaun has one of the worst in the league, but it's interesting because if you actually look at like the PFF grading, their line isn't completely as bad as publicized out there in the media right now. It is going to also fall on Deshaun because he does have to get rid of the ball more consistently in an appropriate time. He does hold on to the ball too long, which is kind of a blessing and curse of his mobility. He is one of the most mobile quarterbacks in the league. You make plays develop off the fly, but that does expose him a little bit as well. As much as I dislike the value on a player like Duke Johnson, he is a needed piece because he does add a new addition to that game as far as a check down running back. And then you look at some of the other pieces on this team, if everyone's healthy, that could really aid in his development. So Will Fuller is returning from ACL injury. He could be one of the most underrated number 2 wide receivers in football. He averages 15.7 yards per reception in 2017, which was one among the top in the leagues. On only 32 receptions, he had 503 yards prior to that injury versus the Dolphins in Week 8. Then, of course, you have Nuck over there, too. It's kind of cool to see him graded as a 99 in Madden 20. Granted, you can't really put too much into those ratings, but I consider him the best wide receiver in the league. What do you think? Do you think Nuck is the best receiver?
I think so. I think you can definitely see it. I would have to maybe compare a little bit more of the stats, right? Because there's definitely, I think, depending on Odell Beckham's situation, he has the potential to be.
Yeah, but the thing you have to knock Beckham on is his availability. He's hurt.
Yeah, he's hurt.
Whereas Hopkins in his career has only missed one game. 2017 missed a game, and I believe the only reason he missed that one was because the Texans were out of the playoffs. That was Bill O'Brien's one losing season. That was the Sean Watson injury year. By the end of the year, they were wide risk injuring a player long term.
Yeah, one of your stars. Yeah, so I think
sorry, I cut you off. But in fact, right now, his only kryptonite was Brock Osweiler in 2016. And even in that year, he had 78 receptions, 954 yards. The only drop-off was the 4 touchdowns, which he's made up for in a big way in both 2017 and 2018, as he's had 24 touchdowns the last 2 years.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, no, I definitely think he's one of the best, if not the best, receivers there is. There's also not a whole lot of buzz around him and negative publicity, and that I think is also something to be said when it comes to having a wide receiver that you can depend on, right? Like, we talk all the negative stuff about Antonio Brown, who was also very productive, but then you have to deal with all of the drama, possibly, issues in the locker room, all of that stuff. You talk about Odell Beckham Jr. and some of the prima donna behavior that he had with the New York Giants. Whereas with Hopkins, you don't really ever hear that coming out of their locker room. You don't ever really hear about him being an issue. And so sometimes that alone, combined with his, production, is really good and makes him one of the best receivers that you could possibly have.
I actually met him, one of the nicest guys I've ever had the opportunity to meet. It's actually going to be interesting. So on this defense, you do have a J.J. Watt who came back in a big way with 16 sacks in 2018. So he's back to being J.J. Watt, which is great to see after only playing 8 games in 2016 and 17. But it's going to be interesting to see how this Jadeveon Clowney holdout affects him and the rest of that team as well. Now, Jadeveon Clowney hasn't quite lived up to our expectations of him given his number 1 overall pick status. He's a 3-time Pro Bowler, but he's never had double-digit sacks. Good player, but what would you say his worth is given he hasn't lived up to the billing of what you expect from a number 1 pick?
I think that's the thing is it's all about value, right? If he were drafted a little bit lower, right, we might not necessarily be having this conversation. There's also some other questions that I have with the defense as well, especially around their secondary. And so I think all of these questions could sort of be a bad situation for Houston. Now, that may mean that Clowney can get paid a little bit more, though, being that, hey, your secondary is not as good, right? But we'll see. What do you think?
Unlike the running backs that are holding out, Jadeveon Clowney definitely is in a better spot, being a edge rusher who can also play both inside and outside. However, I think it's more likely that he gets traded than he signs an extension with the Texans right now. When we talk about teams that could potentially make that move, the Browns are always looking to make a splash. Could be a more interesting dynamic to this team to add him to Myles Garrett. Mm-hmm. I could see him end up with the Giants. They're looking for an edge rusher right now. They made some weird picks, granted, over the last couple of years, but I think why not cash in on a player like Clowney who at least can add some notoriety to your team, take some pressure off of the other young players. And then there's, I've heard another team floated out there, the Eagles, who already have one of the best rosters in the game. You add a Clowney to that, and you're talking about
they could be back.
So with that said, where are we predicting this team to finish?
So I know Houston, that they had won it last season. I haven't taken a step back, though. Like I said, there's questions with the secondary, though I know that they did replace some of the guys that they had lost. With Clowney holding out, I don't know how that's going to affect the locker room. I have them going 10-6.
10-6, that's exactly what I had for them, too. I have the Colts winning this division. It's going to be tight all year. Jaguars finishing 8-8. They're going to keep it close. It's just going to be a dogfight.
Yeah, I think so. And I'm really excited. I think, the Colts and the Texans have two of the best quarterbacks, obviously, in this division. So I'm excited to see some fun football between the two teams.
Okay, moving on to the NFC side of things.
Mm-hmm.
The NFC South, this is also going to be a very competitive division. We're talking about a division that has 2 former MVPs and 3 former Super Bowl quarterbacks in it. And then there's the Bucs. I do see, one of the more interesting notes about this team is they finished 4th in Division 8 of the last 10 years, and it makes sense when you have constantly had the Panthers are good, the Saints are good.
Mm-hmm.
The Falcons have been good at times throughout this run too. And you have 3 established quarterbacks, and then you talk about this team, they have Jameis Winston, and they're really not sure what they have in him right now. He's going to be playing on his 5th year, which means he could be a free agent next year. And ultimately, this is going to be an uber important year for Winston.
Yeah, I think so. And so they just got Bruce Arians, right? And so hopefully he can work some magic with the offense. But you're right, you still don't know what you have with Winston. And he's extremely unpredictable and unreliable, I guess, in a lot of ways. There's times where he can have, fantastic game, looks really good. But he almost throws as many interceptions every year as he does touchdowns, right? So last year he had 14 interceptions, but he had 19 touchdowns. But that's still, at least for every 1 touchdown that you get, you're going to have about 0.75 interceptions, right? So for every 4 touchdowns, you get 3 interceptions.
That's well below the league average and very disappointing he's also a number 1 pick who has underperformed relative to what our expectations are. Hopefully, Arians can lift his stat line.
Yeah, and we talked about, too, right, as the Adam Humphries a little bit earlier. So they lost Adam Humphries, which they replaced him with Brashad Perriman, but Perriman's numbers just aren't quite what Humphries was. So now he has, one, I guess, worse of a target. So it could be a really interesting year for Jameis Winston. And I don't know if we really ever see him as a starter again, if he has a bad year, right, and on any team.
Yeah, that's going to be interesting to see where his next step is if he doesn't really produce this year. Does he go to another team and just be a backup? If he does have a decent year, do Buccaneers think about putting a franchise tag on him? It means you have to pay him $25 million next year to take another 1-year flyer on, hoping that he has a breakthrough. This team also has some very, very big questions on their defense as well. So they lost Quan Alexander, which was a big piece of their defensive unit. They've had questions in their secondary. And then they went ahead and made an interesting franchise decision to release Gerald McCoy and bring in Ndamukong Suh. And that's caused some controversy because McCoy has made some comments saying that he expected his jersey to be retired, and then shortly in a couple weeks, they give Ndamukong Suh's number. It's kind of funny when you look at where McCoy ranks in terms of the Bucs franchise history. He has 54.5 sacks in his Bucs career, which is third all time on the franchise leaderboard, only behind Warren Sapp and Simeon Rice. And then you have Warren Sapp coming out here with, they owe you nothing. You didn't help this team win. Well, in fairness, Warren, like at the end of the day, what is a 4-3 nose tackle going to do to dictate wins and losses?
Exactly. Yeah. And that's the thing, right, is there's a lot of guys who statistically are as good as it gets, right, or some of the best players in the league, and they've been loyal to, for the most part, right, obviously he's with the Panthers now, but he's been loyal for almost a decade, and he just had bad teams around him. Like, what can you say in a very competitive division?
Yeah, exactly. Like, the net amount of points Gerald McCoy scored was never going to be equal to the subpar quarterback play that this team has produced over the years. He's a 6-time Pro Bowler, which if you look at kind of like jersey numbers that have been retired in the Bucs franchise history, only 8 players have made at least 5 Pro Bowls in Bucs history. 3 have had their jersey retired, 3 more unofficially. So Gerald McCoy at 6, it does raise some questions as to how this team could so easily dismiss arguably one of their legends.
Yeah.
I don't really want to talk too much about this team, just given that we have a lot more interesting squads to talk about. I do hope to see Jameis take a step and really live up to his potential, because I don't hate the guy. And I do enjoy seeing Bruce Arians as well. One more piece I want to bring up is whether their pick Ronald Jones can produce in his second year at the running back position. I think it's going to be a big year for him, because if he doesn't produce, he's probably also out the door as well. So overall, I see this team, they were 5-11 last season. They're going to be 4-12 this year in my book.
Oh, you have them going backwards. So no, I think you hit the nail on the head. If there is sort of a saving grace, it will be Bruce Arians if he can work some magic. I do question Byron Leftwich as an offensive coordinator. My pick for this team, though, I hope I'm wrong. I hope Jameis Winston has a great year, but I don't see them doing all that well. So I've got them going 6-10.
Okay, that's respectable. I mean, not the worst in a competitive division, but it's not just the division I question when it comes to them. It's the conference as a whole. Every team can scrap, and I just don't see the Bucs as one of those scrappy teams right now.
Yeah, no, I see that. I can get on board with that.
So the next team we're going to discuss here is going to be the Carolina Panthers. So this team had kind of a roller coaster of a year. So they started the season 6-2, and then ended up going 1-7 in their next 8 games. One of the big kind of turning points in the season was that Thursday night game against the Steelers, where they just got absolutely blown out, 52-21. And Cam Newton took a big hit in that game from TJ Watt, which kind of changed the course of their season, as he suffered a major shoulder injury, one that he had to have surgery on. And it's going to be interesting to see how he bounces back. One of the early reports coming out of camp is that he changed his throwing motion. I don't know how much stock you can really put into that, as if he's pressured or it comes to a point where he has to get his team back into the game. I feel as though he's going to revert back to the old throwing motion. He's been doing that motion for, close to 20 years of playing football versus the 1 year of a new form. I don't know if it's going to stick necessarily like he would hope to.
Exactly. And you're exactly right. When it comes to a live game situation, has the one, sort of off season of changing your throwing motion, has that outweighed your years and years of practice, right? And what you've been used to. And so when you're under pressure and you got to get rid of the ball, you're not thinking about, hey, is my throwing form exactly right? It's, hey, I got to get rid of the ball, I've got to throw it. And whatever your motion is, that you just naturally revert to, I think he'll just go back to it.
Yeah, one of the big questions I want to ask just right off the bat is, have we seen Cam Newton in his last Super Bowl?
I think maybe. In fact, I guess that's being on the fence, so I'll say yes. Especially with his injuries, right? With, some of the behavior and all that stuff. They got Will Greer, right, to put him on notice. I think we've seen Cam in his last Super Bowl. But
I don't think Will Grier is that big of a thing to worry about if you're Cam. Will Grier is not going to replace Cam Newton. I do think that I've heard this theory thrown around when it comes to Will Grier because they do see him as an NFL starter. He could be potentially like Carolina's Jimmy Garoppolo, where they just kind of keep him on the bench, hang him around as trade bait for the next couple of years behind Cam. Hopefully he develops a little bit more. And we'll probably see him eventually. When it comes to Cam, though, he did improve his completion percentage last year. Definitely has been utilizing Christian McCaffrey in the passing game, short yardage to do that. However, when you look at how the league is kind of changing around him, the focus on more accurate passers, the bubble screens, the quick pass attacks, those are more where the league is at. And I don't know if Cam will be able to keep up, especially when you consider they're going to reduce the amount of times he can really use his athleticism. Let Cam be Cam, run outside the pocket, make those explosive plays, run over defenders. He's not going to be doing that into his mid-30s. So,
yeah. Well, not only that, but we talked about, we talked about Andrew Luck and his injuries, but Cam Newton's had quite a few injuries himself, right? So, I mean, even dating all the way back to his NCAA's career, there was, ankle sprains, time and time again, ankle ligament tears, chest and rib fractures. He's broken his back, concussions, rotator cuff, tears, knee strains, shoulder injuries, shoulder surgeries. And so I don't know if his body can even hold up that long. We'll see how he recovers from shoulder surgery, but he's another one of the really injury-prone quarterbacks that we have.
I'm intrigued to see kind of how the weapons around him look this year. So I don't know if you've seen any recent pictures of Christian McCaffrey. It looks like the guy's put on another 5 to 15 pounds of muscle this year. So coming a long way from only putting up 10 reps on bench at the 2017 Combine. I'm interested to see, do you think Christian McCaffrey could be a 1,000-yard rusher, 1,000-yard receiving out of the backfield?
I think he could be at that elite level, though there are some times where weight doesn't necessarily help you. I think in this situation it probably will, right? But Le'Veon Bell, when he first came into the league, he actually had to lose weight to be a better running back, right? Especially when you're talking about a running back that also has a lot of receiving yards, right? But I'm excited to see him. I do think he can compete with some of the best backs in the league and possibly could be a top 3 back.
Well, if you have to critique any point of Run CMC's game, it's definitely running in between the tackles. So I definitely think the added strength will help him in that regard. Albeit, sometimes putting on muscle mass can leave you more exposed to injury sometimes. Obviously, you're less flexible, have less range of motion. So we'll see how he goes being able to run with that additional weight on. It's going to be a second year for DJ Moore, the first-round pick out of the 2018 draft. He underwhelmed a little bit last year. He had more fumbles than he had touchdowns, 3 fumbles, 2 touchdowns last year. In the last 6 years, there hasn't been a receiver that's led Carolina in receptions. Greg Olsen led the team from 2013 to 2016, and obviously the last 2 years, Christian McCaffrey has been the top receiving target for Cam Newton. So I'm not too crazy confident in DJ Moore being able to be one of those top 20 type receivers in the game, especially too, there is a potential Greg Olsen does come back this year. He's dealt with multiple foot breaks last couple years, limited him to just 16 games over the last 2 years, only 44 receptions. Other than that, what are you kind of think for this team? They did draft also Brian Burns out of FSU, I should also mention, too, which could add some elements to their defense.
Yeah, so let's see. I think from an offensive standpoint, if Cam is okay, right, I think they'll be middle of the pack. I think they'll be all right. Their defense was only 19th in points allowed, which is not awful, right? It's not the worst in the league. So having Brian Burns hopefully helps that, though I think that might be more valuable when it comes to their yards allowed, which they're already sort of middle of the pack. So I think if Cam can get back to the way, that he was playing back when they were in the Super Bowl, and the investments that they made in their O-line, if all of that comes together, their defense starts to come together, I can see him having a decent year. But right now I put him at 8-8.
8-8. Okay. Well, you did mention their defense. I do want to say they also do have very talented veterans. Obviously, we mentioned Gerald McCoy when it came to his transition from the Bucs. He's going to be a leader on that defense. And then you can't talk the Panthers without mentioning Luke Kuechly's name. As long as he's on the field, you have a quarterback for your defensive unit, one of the smartest players in the game. And I do think that's going to help any defense. I will say I have this team also finishing 8-8. Just they're good, but I just see them about a middle-of-the-road team this year. Shifting away from the Carolina Panthers, let's move on to the team that finished second in this division, the Atlanta Falcons. They were in the Super Bowl just 3 years back, but now they're stuck in a perpetual loop of being one of the most famous, notorious internet memes right now. Will 28-3 memes ever die, Andre?
Probably not. I mean, that's the thing about the era of, social media and stuff like that is, once you have one bad offense, right, it's going to stick with you forever. Just think about the Golden State memes, right? The 3-1, even though, they're world champs many times over since then, they're still always going to be the 3-1 memes. So.
Well, because of that meme, LeBron has nothing left to prove, but let's focus in on the here for this one. Okay, Matty Ice, this is going to be another big year for him. Like, he has that MVP trophy in his shelf right now, but one of the big questions a lot of people have is, can he get back to that same tier? What tier does he fall into? You did have the NFL Top 100 list come out a few weeks ago, and he was ranked below players like Baker and Deshaun, who haven't really even done anything in the NFL to this point. How do you feel about how underrated Matt Ryan is in the game today? Yeah,
so, if you look at it statistically, right, I think he is by far the most underrated quarterback in the game. So, just last season, he had 4,924 yards, 296 rushing, 35 touchdowns, 7 interceptions. He was sacked a little bit more than usual, but he's having pretty much Pro Bowler seasons every single year. Not only that, but over the past 2 seasons, he's number 1 in air yards. So what that is passing without yards after reception. So that means he's this metric, I guess you could say, it's less help from your receivers and more of just, can you throw the ball far and can you throw it accurately? And he's number 1 in that compared to all quarterbacks. His completion percentage, I want to say, is 5th, and he's 3rd in touchdowns over the past 2 years. So outside of, really being able to win the last few seasons, statistically, he's one of the best quarterbacks that we have, possibly even a top 5 quarterback in the league. But winning is what a lot of people look at. And so if you put a lot of weight into winning, yeah, he's not necessarily always able to win, but I think he's definitely one of the most underrated quarterbacks possibly ever. What are your thoughts?
Well, he definitely eats more W's than Jameis, but do you truly believe he's a top 5 quarterback? Is that kind of where you rank him when you think about him amongst the other top quarterbacks in the game?
So if you look at it, right, from a pure statistics and ability standpoint and talent standpoint, I would say he's top 5. Now, there is something to be said, right, about, are you just a born winner? And so there's some guys where statistically maybe they're not as good, but they just find a way to win, right? So Tom Brady, for instance, this is always the argument with him versus Aaron Rodgers, is Aaron Rodgers statistically and talent-wise is better, right? But Brady's just always found a way to win and has more rings. And I think that's a lot of times what happens with Matt Ryan, is Matt Ryan is very good talent-wise and probably is a top 5 talent, I would say, in the league. I could see maybe if you're no, he's not top 5, I'd put him closer to top 10, right? Because there are quite a few really good quarterbacks still. But I would say right now, talent-wise, yes, I would put him probably top 5.
Yeah, I think that's completely fair. You mentioned the idea of finding ways to win. He's just always going to receive flack for finding a way to lose in that Super Bowl. It was one of his low points, and it's one of the biggest low points in the history of football, unfortunately. Hard to overcome. I don't know if his coach, Dan Quinn, will be able to overcome that for too much longer himself. Whereas I think the team's more committed to Matt Ryan past this year. If Dan Quinn doesn't perform, I think I could see them moving on from him. They did bring in a familiar face in terms of their offensive coordinator, Dirk Cutter. He was back there 2013, back when they made it to the NFC Championship game. You haven't really seen a team that's been so dependent on an offensive coordinator like this Falcons team. when they lost Kyle Shanahan, it was definitely very noticeable. When they had a resort to hiring Steve Sarkisian was fine, but he was kind of Shanahan light, diet Kyle Shanahan, if you will. And I think a lot of people were expecting that year 2 under Sarkisian, Ryan would have took a much bigger leap. In the same way, in year 2 of Kyle Shanahan's offense, Matt Ryan established himself as an MVP candidate, as opposed to the previous year, the first year in Shanahan's offense. He actually struggled in the red zone, and that was one of the bigger narratives regarding him prior to, again, exploding onto the scene. 38 touchdowns, like you said, close to 5,000 passing yards that year, and just an absurd touchdown to interception ratio. Besides Matt Ryan, you also have to talk about his targets, a lot of the players that will be catching the ball for him this year. In that backfield, you have Devontae Freeman, and it's going to be his backfield all to himself this year. You will see some Ito Smith worked in, but not quite the same way you saw Tevin Coleman be a part of the offense. Coleman was definitely more of a more prototypical third-round back that could carry the workload in the event that Devontae Freeman went down. If Ito Smith is thrust into a bigger role because of Devontae Freeman's health, I don't think this team will be as successful. Freeman missed a majority of the games in 2018 because he was battling knee, groin, foot injuries. That's a lot of injuries for one back.
Yeah, and that's the thing is we're always talking about, the health and safety of these players. And running backs have the most sort of pressure on them. They're taking the most hits out of any of the players. And so Devontae Freeman is back from injury, though I don't know how long he can stay healthy. And if he's not healthy the entire season, is Ito Smith good enough to carry an entire role of a running back one? And from what I've seen, it doesn't appear to be that way. Maybe he has made a lot of gains and big steps forward, but right now I can't see Ito Smith being a reliable starting back.
And if they have an inconsistent running game, then you could argue they'll probably double down on the passing game. And when you have receivers like Julio Jones, who's a top 3 wide receiver in the league, probably deserves to be the highest paid once again when he gets another pay jump, presumably this year or the next. And then you have Calvin Ridley, the second receiver there. Big rookie season. He had 10 touchdowns, double-digit touchdowns in your rookie year is definitely something to not turn your nose at. Really telling of how highly regarded Nick Saban viewed Ridley. He viewed him as one of the better competitors he had. And, when you talk about like Nick Saban, like from the college to the pro game, he's seen a lot of NFL talent walk through that Alabama locker room. So to hear how highly he regards Ridley is definitely something.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, they also have, Mohamed Sanu, who's by no means, yes, he's only their third best wide receiver, but that's a pretty good third option. And I know we talk a lot about duos in the league, right? So you got your Adam Thielen, Stephon Diggs, Julio Jones, and Calvin Ridley. If Calvin Ridley can continue to maintain his production like he had last year, I could see them, being sort of that argument of, hey, maybe they're one of the best duos in the league, right? So I was definitely impressed with Calvin Ridley's season. I think, like I said, Mohamed Sanu adds to that depth at wide receiver and options. And, of course, Julio Jones is Julio Jones. He's a monster.
I just want to add one more thing to Freeman, too. When he was at his best, he was very involved in the passing game, had over 50 receptions in both 2015 and 2016. And if he adds that element back to his game, then too, that's going to be another huge plus for Matt Ryan in this offense. One of the big things, though, that really hurt this team last year was definitely the defensive side of the ball. You can argue that it wasn't necessarily for lack of talent. It was lack of talent's ability to stay on the field. Deion Jones is one of the better linebackers in the league. He missed 10 games with that foot injury last year. But it's kind of amazing. In just 6 games, he did record 53 tackles. And I guarantee that played a big role in why the Falcons decided to sign that guy for a 4-year contract extension with $34 million guarantee. They believe in his ability to lead that defense long term. And I think that they could definitely see a boost this year with better health, better luck moving forward. And that's going to lead this team to be a potential playoff team again.
Yeah, so I think that's the thing. From what I noticed, they don't have a whole lot of free agent pickups on the defense. They did draft some defensive players who some of them I've seen like a lot of good notes about them in their sort of draft reports. That being said, I just don't know how much they can contribute right now. So it really is going to rely a lot on can their defensive pieces that they lost last year due to injury come back, stay healthy, and continue to play at a high level. And if they can, yes, I could possibly see them getting back to at least partially their form of when they made the Super Bowl. Hopefully both offense and defense can stay healthy. and we can see the best version of this team.
Okay, so with that said, where do you rank this team?
So this team, the tough thing, right, is they're always going to be in a division where you got Drew Brees, and anytime Drew Brees is playing in your division, it's tough to win it. They went 9-7 last season, 7-9 last season. So I'm going to do the reverse. I'm going to say they do improve just because they get their pieces back, though I worry about some health. So I'm going to say 9-7 this season.
I'm going to go ahead and give them 10-6 and put them as one of my wild card teams for this year. I definitely do foresee like a improvement for Matty Ice. I think he's going to come back to form. I don't know if he's going to be quite at that MVP level he was a few years back, but he's definitely going to be in that conversation, I believe. Moving on, so you talk about roadblocks. Obviously, we have the New Orleans Saints in this division. Will the Saints be able to breeze to a title, or are they too busy thinking about last year?
So, man, dad jokes again, Ju-Ju, dad jokes.
I know, I still.
So, I think, I guess let's start with, do you think they got screwed last year, right? So there's a whole lot of, it was the one PI call, right, that you guys didn't give, and that's what kept us out of the Super Bowl. So do you think they got screwed last year?
Well, it's interesting. Whenever we do have like a huge call like that, we tend to forget that there's essentially 59 other minutes of game, including in this game, the extra overtime. Now, I think it's egregious, when you have a game where all eyeballs are on it and something like that happens. I do think that the NFL may have overcorrected in this situation.
Yeah.
Their decision to change the ability of coaches to be able to throw challenge flags on PIs. I don't care as much about like the Hail Mary per se, but I do think that I'm kind of like not excited to see how these judgment calls are ruled. And I don't think that the results are always going to be the same, in the same way that the ambiguity of the catch rule was so frustrating to fans just a few years back. I think that's going to be the same thing when we talk about reviewing these challenges. Going back to the main thing about the Saints, it's kind of funny actually, in a division where there's 2 league MVPs, Drew Brees actually owns neither of them. Do you think this will be the first year that he's able to pull down that accomplishment?
So he did make a Pro Bowl last year, right? He had his highest completion percentage, which is the highest it's ever been. So arguably you could say that, yeah, he's playing the best football that he ever has. And statistically, right, like he's one of the most accurate quarterbacks probably ever, which is impressive, especially for being a quarterback at his height. He's not generally considered one of your bigger quarterbacks, right? So I think if they were, to win their division and he makes another really, deep playoff run, getting close to a Super Bowl, I could see him possibly getting an MVP this year. I do wonder about sort of his biological and physical timeline though, right? So he's also playing in his year 40 season. And I know we always talk about when is Tom Brady going to take that hit, right, and fall off the ledge. Well, we've seen that Brees has been injured. In fact, that was one of the reasons why they shipped him out of San Diego. And so being, age 40, being a little bit undersized as a quarterback, can Drew Brees stay healthy at least for the next few seasons, including this one, to win that MVP? I don't know.
Well, I'm not so much worried about him taking a big shot and that being the end of his season. I am worried about his stamina compared to like a lot of the younger quarterbacks in the league. One noticeable trend that I saw, and it all took place in that big Dallas game that he played, was prior to playing Dallas, where they lost 13-10, they were averaging 37.18 points per game. Now, think about how ridiculous that is for an NFL team to be able to put up. 37, close to 40 points a game. They put up over 40 against the Eagles, Rams, Vikings. They put up 50 on the Bengals. This was one of the most explosive, unreal offenses to see. And then, and excluding Week 17 because Teddy Bridgewater played, over the final 6 games with Drew Brees, they averaged 20.67 points per game. We're talking about a 17-point drop-off in production. You can argue, did they just fall back to the mean? Or was something in that Dallas game, did they figure something out and made essentially not only Drew Brees, but the Saints offense just average?
Yeah, so I think it was just a little bit of regression back to the mean, right? So it's hard to continue to maintain that production. Though I do think it is interesting, right, that you point out is Drew Brees' stamina over the season. And that's going to be the thing. If you're already starting to see him tail off towards the end of just the regular season, does he at 40 years old, right, 40 plus, have that energy to continue that production towards the end of the season? And so I think part of it could have just been like hey, we're really explosive at the start of the season. We have a lot of energy. As the season goes on, guys have been taking more and more hits. You've been doing a whole lot of workouts. Your body's starting to get sore, right? You've wasted a lot of energy at the start of the season. And so you're just naturally starting to regress a little bit.
And I think that one thing, too, is this team is definitely going to rely on Brees a little harder this year. I think that everyone just naturally assumes that the Saints are just going to be able to slot into that title contender position they've been the last couple of years. But it's hard to come back from the two heartbreaking playoff losses they've had these last two seasons, between the pass interference call last year and then in Minneapolis Miracle a couple of years back. Now, I do believe that one of Drew Brees' most unique characteristics is his ability to elevate the talent around him. And he's definitely going to need that, because they lost Mark Ingram to the Ravens this year. Their center, Max Unger, he retired. And, those are the two key losses there in particular. Unger was a 3-time Pro Bowler. Ingram was a multi-time Pro Bowler as well and was a dynamic 1-2 punch with Kamara. It's interesting because I think back to Thanksgiving Day, where it's kind of amazing. So Drew Brees threw 4 touchdowns against the Falcons on Thanksgiving. How many of those do you think went to Alvin Kamara or Michael Thomas?
For the touchdowns that he threw?
Yes. In a game that Drew Brees threw 4 touchdowns, how many of them went to a combination of Kamara, Thomas, and I'll even throw in Mark Ingram? Well, I'll give away the answer. The answer is 0. In that game, he threw touchdowns to Tommy Lee Lewis, Austin Carr, Dan Arnold, and Keith Kirkwood. So if you are a fantasy football owner, you probably threw your remote against the television screen seeing that. But it's interesting that, like I said, like Drew Brees has the unique ability to elevate the talent around him, get the most out of younger receivers. I definitely do think maybe even Traquan Smith could take a bigger role in this offense. It's funny, too, during Michael Thomas's recent holdout, Keith Kirkwood, even though I kind of mentioned his name in jest, Kirkwood was actually taking first-team reps during Michael Thomas's holdout. So that might be a name to kind of keep your eye out on. But speaking about the main guy, can't guard Mike Thomas. So, again, we're going to just pose this question. Is Michael Thomas the best receiver in the league? Because he's getting paid like it.
So maybe here in a few seasons, somebody else, gets paid more and then the market balances itself out. Michael Thomas has had outstanding numbers ever since he came into the league. I mean, he was definitely worth, the contract boost and extension, though it's a little bit early maybe to give him that, right? Like, he's got to compete with, DeAndre Hopkins, Antonio Brown. Like I said, we'll see what OBJ can do now that he has sort of a better offensive scheme around him and a better quarterback throwing to him. So I don't know. I thought it was definitely a lot of money. What I will say, I do like the fact that the Saints recognize, hey, Michael Thomas has been putting in the work. So from what I hear, from day one, Michael Thomas has always been doing everything as hard as he can, right? He practices as hard as he can. He lifts as hard as he can, does, drills as hard as he can. And is always putting in the work, and he has put up the production to meet, his hard work. I don't know if I would have made him the highest paid receiver in the league. What do you think?
Well, it's going to be interesting to see kind of more or less how the Saints choose to distribute their money over the next few years, because you do have interesting players that they manage to still in later rounds. Like eventually Alvin Kamara is going to come to the point where he's going to need to get a contract. You're going to talk about players like Marshawn Lattimore is eventually going to have to get a deal. You have this aging quarterback named Drew Brees, too, that's actually playing out the last year of his contract. That's going to be very heavily discussed. In fact, the funny thing about the quarterback room right now for the Saints is they have neither of these guys under contract for next year. So I'm sure they're going to figure out a way to keep either a combination of Drew Brees and Teddy Bridgewater, or throw as much money as they can to just keep Drew Brees going for another few years. It'd be nice if they could keep Bridgewater because they've invested a lot of time in making him that heir apparent. Mm-hmm. And I do want to see Teddy Bridgewater eventually claim a role with a good coach like Sean Payton rather than go off to some random team to potentially fade into obscurity.
Yeah. Yeah. And I mean, Teddy Bridgewater himself had some pretty decent seasons, right? Back when he was up in Minnesota. So I'd like to see him take over. The one thing I wonder about, so going back to losing Max Unger, right, is they sort of need a center as well in order to protect their quarterback. And in fact, centers a lot of times are the most important piece on that O-line. And so it seems like they weren't able to pick up a very good center, at least this season, right? So they picked up Nick Easton and drafted Eric McCoy, who was the second highest rated center in the draft. But if neither of them pan out, right, you're probably going to have to either hope you can draft another really good center or try to pick up a really good center in free agency. And if you're spending a lot of your money, do you think they would have the ability to be able to bring in another center?
I definitely am not going to discount the importance of offensive line. Obviously, we've talked about a lot of teams with bad offensive lines in this episode. I do think that these crafty older quarterbacks like Brady and Breeze, though, have figured out a way to disrupt pass rushes in the quick strike passing game. So unless you're playing teams like the Rams, who have Aaron Donald that could really bring a lot of heat up the middle, there's not a lot of great centers around the league. Offensive line play has been down at least the last few years, just in general, league-wide. There's not a lot of great offensive line talent coming out of the draft recently, save a Quentin Nelson, and a few bright spots in between. So it's kind of unfortunately, a bit of a crapshoot in terms of drafting. So maybe they could piece it together. I definitely do think that Drew Brees is the type that can even elevate the play of his offensive line with what he does to stay upright himself. Mm-hmm. You know, one of the big things that kind of like was a big turning point for this Saints team a couple of years when they moved from being out of the playoffs to being back in the title hunt was when they improved their defense. Mm-hmm. Now, they lost Alex Okafor to the Chiefs this year, but this is going to be a big year for Marcus Davenport. They traded away a lot of draft capital. In fact, they didn't even have a first-round pick this year because they traded for Davenport the previous year, trading away that pick to the Packers. And then they also traded away a 2019 fourth-round pick to acquire Eli Apple. So they made some changes to this defense. Going back to Davenport, when he first came out of the University of Texas San Antonio, he was noted as a bit of a raw prospect. And when you talk about players in the Senior Bowl his given year, PFF rated him one of the worst in terms of win rate, so gaining an advantage on an offensive lineman, which that's discouraging when he's supposed to be your top pass rusher on your team. Well, save for Cam Jordan, of course, but like top outside linebacker pass rush. Also on this team, like I mentioned, you do have Marshawn Lattimore here. He has been a top 10 cornerback according to PFF the last couple years. Quarterbacks, when targeting Marshawn Lattimore, are only throwing for a 68.8 passer rating, and he has earned an 88.7 coverage grade over the last 2 years. So they really got a steal there. In fact, it's kind of funny about this team. They really love their Ohio State players between Marshawn Lattimore, Eli Apple, Ted Ginn, and who am I missing? Oh, well, star of the team, Michael Thomas. They really love their Buckeyes there. So, you know.
Yeah, and I mean, the Buckeyes always produce great talent. They play in a great conference, right? So the Big Ten always has tough teams that you're playing. Even, you know, your teams that maybe are not always competing for a national championship, but you get your teams like your Iowas and stuff like that that will always put up at least a decent fight. So I think a lot of the guys that come out of there, that come out of Ohio State, are also well coached, but battle tested, right? So.
Yeah. So one key story I'm going to be looking forward to is Eli Apple going to be able to perform like the top 10 pick he was? He was drafted by the Giants in 2016. Then he was traded away last year kind of abruptly. Former teammates like Landon Collins call him a cancer to the locker room, which is definitely not something you want to hear. But when you look at kind of like the Saints' production after he came, so they were just getting absolutely abused on their secondary corner position. They were a bottom 3 defense in terms of pass defense last year prior to Eli Apple coming. And they didn't take a drastic step forward. They were still like about 22. when he did get there, but it did show improvement. And I do think second year of comfortability in this defense can be a huge plus to Eli Apple's production alongside Marshawn Lattimore.
Yeah, and I mean, I also wonder how much of it is being, in maybe a better system, right? So, or at least a system that matches Eli Apple a little bit more. And how, like you said, comfortability right there. And that was my main concern with this team. We know that the offense is always going to be electric. Yes, they did lose some key pieces, but like you said, the passing defense for most of last year, they were ranked like 29th. They're 14th in a lot of the other metrics. So they're either bad to mediocre in most of their defensive metrics, except for their rush defense. The rush defense was extremely good, so they were ranked second in the league. Though, does losing Alex Okafor impact that? I don't know, but I think that's going to be my main concern with this team is, have they improved defensively? And I'm not saying it's a huge concern, right? Like, I don't think they're going to be a bad team by any means, but I would like to see more improvements on the defensive end.
Yeah, the last thing I'll close out with is it's going to be a big year to see what Alvin Kamara can do in that backfield by himself. But then again, actually, I should say he's not necessarily by himself. They've actually had a interesting undrafted rookie end up over there. Devin Ozingbo from Nebraska. I'm hearing a lot of good things about this guy. He's gained first-team reps. And when you talk about the Saints, they have actually a very great history in terms of getting undrafted rookies on this team. And, I mean, Alvin Kamara is a prime example of them being able to come up with steals past the draft.
Yeah, and the other thing, right, is that there are so many other options, right? And Breeze can make use of so many other options that it can sometimes take pressure off of your backs, right? Or at least make the defenses be forced to cover, right? Some of those other, whether it's deep coverage or whatever it is. And so you relieve a little bit of your pressure on some of your more rookie backs and give them more of an opportunity, more space to run.
Okay, so let's go ahead and close this out with our predictions. I am going to say that the New Orleans Saints are going to finish 11-5 this year. That's going to be my prediction for them. They were 13-3 last year, but I do think the division is going to be more competitive around them, which is going to cause a little bit of a fall off. But I still have them obviously winning 11-5. I gave the Falcons 10-6 and the Panthers 8-8.
Yeah, so I chose the exact same score. I think they're going to be 11-5. Like I said, they lost a lot of their key, well, not a lot, but they lost some key offensive pieces. I think they'll be just fine, but I do have them sliding backwards just a little bit. Still win the division, though.
Perfect. All right. Well, that's going to put a bow on this episode. Thank you, Dre, for coming on board, and we'll see you next week.
Yep. See you next week, Ju-Ju.